Hi Equals, it's Kim, and today we're still talking about LGBT youth, partially around the juvenile justice system, but actually much broader. So I want to read something that I came across yesterday. Yesterday was Sunday. I'll let you guess where I found this. But I do kind of need to read it, so I've got my glasses on today, and I will be looking away in order to read that. But I wanted to frame our discussion today with this as the start. You, and that can be whatever you all find true in your own hearts, you created us to live in community, yet we often oppress others and separate ourselves from each other and from you. So Jesus demonstrated your love of children, yet there are still so many children in the world who live in hunger or fear, feeling rejected and unloved. Feeling rejected and unloved. Forgive us and remind us of your call for faithfulness in all parts of our lives. Nurture us and all your children, with your love and forgiveness so that we might share the abundant gifts of your creation. Now, I do believe that a lot of people who have faith, who have deep-rooted issues with people who are LGBT, mean well. In their minds, they are encouraging, leading, shaming people into lives of holiness. I'm going to challenge that a little bit because I don't think that the way to lead somebody to a life of holiness is to shame them into it. And I don't think that in efforts to change someone in order to live a life of holiness, that we are embracing God's full creation. And I'm going to be talking in another video, we'll do this one, about the breadth of God's creation around sexual orientation and gender identity. So we'll carry that through as a theme for a little while. Maybe this section will be called the abundance of creation or something. I'll see what I decide to name it in the end. What I want to talk about today is something called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And this is just around sexual orientation. Some of you may recognize these as privilege questions. So, as in our society, if you are male, white, educated, are generally considered privileged. If you're also a woman and white and educated, you are also considered privileged. But we all have varying degrees of privilege. So I have privilege around the fact that I'm white. I have privilege around the fact that I am college educated, although I'm not sure that that's that big of a privilege, but it is. And I have, what I don't have privilege around is my sexual orientation. So what this is kind of a list, and I'm not going to read them all, but we will talk about a few of them, of things that if you have privilege in a situation, there are things you don't actually have to think about. That's kind of what privilege means, is that you can move through the world without having to think about certain things. And it depends on which privilege we're talking about. All right, so what am I talking about? For example, this list, the things I'm going to read, are things that straight folks don't have to think about on a daily or frequent basis because they have privilege. Whereas LGBT folks, or LGB, which is what I'm going to be talking about right now, I have a whole separate list for the T. For LGB folks, these are things that they do have to think about on kind of a daily or a frequent basis. If you intersect LGB status with being a person of color or a person who is disabled or who fits any of those other non-privileged demographics, then you add on an entirely additional layer, and I want to recognize that I don't carry those additional layers, but they do exist and we need to think about them in terms of the intersectionality. So for example, on a daily basis, as a straight person, I can go for months without being called straight, whereas I can't. So back to the list. I'm not asked to think about why I am straight. Right? So I don't get this question asked like to my face. I don't. But I certainly read about it when I'm reading about people who oppose dignity and respect for LGBT persons, that I run into this question about, having to think about why, what caused, what, all of that kind of stuff. The point is, it didn't. It's just the way I am. So professionally, I do speak for a lot of people who are LGBT and T. But if you're heterosexual, you're not asked to speak for all straight people. It's like society thinks that I am somehow representative or know every LGBT person and their entire life story, and I can speak for them. And that is not the case. But straight folks aren't asked to do that for all the other straight folks in the world. Nobody calls me straight as an insult. People do not assume I am experienced in sex, right, or that I even have it, merely because of my sexual orientation. Often if people talk about their sexual orientation, there's assumption that they're actually engaging in behaviors. People may not. A straight person can be straight and be a virgin. Right? Same thing. A LGBT person can be an LGBT person and still be a virgin. The behavior is separate from the identity. Behavior acting on, engaging in sexual behavior is different than being. And so, a lot of people think that, I tell the story of a friend of mine long time ago who went to a conservative church, and they had a support group for parents whose children were LGBT or T. And it was a, how to bring your child to holiness type group. It wasn't a PFLAG group by any means. And he went just to see what it was like. And he went and kind of got to know the folks, and they loved talking to him. And one time he said, well, I haven't had a date in 6 months. And they were like, yay, you're not gay anymore. And he's like, no, you don't get it. I can be totally, not engaging in sexual behavior and still be gay. They're not the same thing. The identity and the behavior are not the same thing. This one actually is one that resonates with me, which is when I talk about my heterosexuality, such as in a joke or talking about my relationships, I will not be accused of pushing my sexual orientation onto others. So for me, how this looks is like if I hold my partner's hand, hold my spouse's hand, then I am forcing other people to recognize us as a lesbian couple and somehow pushing my sexual orientation on them. Whereas when straight folks hold hands and walk down the street, they're not pushing their sexual orientation on me, but somehow when I do it, I'm pushing my sexual orientation on them. Now, yes, walking down the street, not holding hands, people could say, oh, they're just good friends. They're just, out together, two women together out doing whatever, going to dinner, shopping, right? We hold hands, then our relationship changes in their eyes. But that's their problem, not my problem. In society, we consider that we treat everyone equally. And so if straight folks can walk down the street holding hands, then LGBT folks should be able to walk down the street holding hands. Simple as that. So I do not have to fear that if my family or friends finds out about my sexual orientation, there will be economic, emotional, physical, or psychological consequences. Straight folks grow up with the expectation from their parents and friends, for the most part, that they will be heterosexual. And so there is no moment in which, as an adolescent, you have to sit your parents down and say, hey, folks, I need to tell you this, but I'm straight. And now I know that there might be a few families where that happens, but for the most part, it's just assumed that you are. And so you never actually have to do that. And you never have to come out to somebody and worry about how your parents are going to take it. It's what your parents want. It's what your parents expect. So it's an entirely different thing when you're LGBT and you have to sit down and talk to your parents or think about what's going to happen when you tell your parents or family or friends. I can choose to not think politically about my sexual orientation. I mean, my entire career is around essentially my sexual orientation and trying to be treated with dignity and respect and equality by my government and by public businesses. And so I have to think about it every day. Straight folks don't. People can use terms that describe my sexual orientation and mean positive things. For example, straight as an arrow, standing up straight, straightened out, instead of demeaning, like, ooh, that's gay. This happens with terms about women's body parts too. I think I did a episode a little bit earlier about this. So I can be open about my sexual orientation without worrying about my job, whether I lose it, don't get promoted. You know, around the water cooler, people are talking about what they did this weekend. And they're talking about this girlfriend there, or that boyfriend there, or that husband or this wife, and the things that they did. And I have to think, well, if I engage in this conversation, could I be negatively impacted? Could I be accused of pushing my sexual orientation on the other people around the water cooler? Could I, and if I do engage in the conversation, I have to think, okay, what pronouns am I going to use? Am I going to give away? Like, I could probably maybe talk about where my spouse and I went this weekend, but I might say spouse and not use her as the pronoun in order to avoid anybody detecting that I was in a same-sex relationship. I know I've done that before. I worked at a Catholic school. Along with those language pieces, I did not grow up with games that attack my sexual orientation. For example, smear the queer. So anyway, it's something to think about in that, you know, being straight is a place of privilege because you don't have to think about these things on a daily, weekly, or regular basis. And LGBT folks do. To bring it back to the young folks in the juvenile justice, I think that people who work with young people or work with LGBT people need to be aware. See, here's this list. Unpacking the invisible knapsack. We'll talk about gender identity in the next episode. There's also implicit bias, things you believe about LGBT people, and this list might, help you see some of those. Anyway, I'm not going to bring this around quite to a close because the next episode will do the same thing around gender identity. In conclusion today, let's come back to that very first reading that I talked about. So Jesus demonstrated your love of children, yet there are still so many children in the world who live in hunger or fear, feeling rejected and unloved. It is our religious, Christian, whatever duty, insert whatever word works for you, to love one another. We just may disagree on what love means. So maybe as a society, maybe one way of making America compassionate again is to have a common definition about what it means to love one another. I'd love to have you put in the comments below your thoughts. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, hit the bell so that you get notified every time I do a new video. I'd love to have you, let's have a conversation in the comments. Have a good week, equals. Bye.